Erev Tov, great to see everybody. Great to be together as we continue our journey through the book of Bamidbar with Nechama Leibowitz. I started my way into the introductions to the volumes of Breshit and the first section of Shemot, which do give a little more insight into how these collections were organized. Some of them more heavily edited from the various leaflets, the Gilionot, as they were called, the individual Parsha sheets that she put out over the years. And in the introduction to Breshit, this translator, Aryeh Newman, who did a lot of the collation and collecting and editing as well, has some extraordinary excerpts from a letter that she wrote upon putting out her final leaflets, her final Parsha sheets, in which she writes this extraordinary, really tribute to her students. But unwittingly, it's really a testament to her devotion to teaching and the range of population of people that she reaches. So she says how, amazing she finds it that, people are taking time to learn in the middle of the day, and she gets messages and letters from doctors and kibbutzniks and, all of these people from all different walks of life and all backgrounds from all around Israel and beyond who correspond with her, and how much she's in awe of their commitment. And of course, again, it's reflective of her commitment as a teacher. There's a great little line where she says she even hears from people, outside of the land of Israel. And in parentheses, she writes, "Oh my, I don't know why they would live there." So you get a sense of her deep connection to Eretz Yisrael as well. And I'll try to send, maybe before next week, maybe even for your Shavuot perusal, a couple of accessible articles that give like an insight and a kind of an overview into her style and her approach. Although again, her self-described approach is I just present the commentaries on the Parsha and try to understand them. But obviously, people who study her at length have distilled some of the key stylistic aspects of her, of her analysis and composition. So there's a lot there, and I'll try to share a couple of things before next week. Oh, look who it is! Oh, guys. Monitor to email, okay? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll start on this week's Parsha. Okay, so this is the second of her two essays on Birkat Kohanim, which appears in this week's Parashah, Parashat Naso. I'll just take a moment to get the context there. Beginning in chapter 6, that's not the beginning of the parasha, but in chapter 6 we have the law of the Nazir, the various prescriptions and proscriptions, and then the sacrifices that are involved at the conclusion of the Nazirite period, and what happens if a Nazir violates, wittingly or unwittingly, one of the guidelines of the Nazirite oath. And just at the conclusion of that, after Zot Torat HaNazir, this is the teaching or guidelines of the Nazir, then we have these psukim. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, speak to Aaron and his sons to say, this is how you should bless the children of Israel. You should say to them. And then we have those three lines, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Ye'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichoneka, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. And then this concluding comment by God, V'samu et shmi al b'nei Yisrael, v'ani avarchem. Thus they, the priests, shall link my name with the children of Israel, and I will bless them. And in the previous essay, Nechama spends time trying to understand what's the relationship between, God, the Kohanim, and the Jewish people. In what way are the Kohanim intermediaries? Do they also receive blessing? Those are sort of the themes of the previous one. And now she comes really to focus on the last of the three blessings. So here we have a layout again. I haven't gone back to check against some of the Gilionot and see whether this was her own layout or the editor compiler here, but you see that she intentionally, or in this way this edition is presented, the three blessings are intentionally laid out in a kind of a pyramid structure, rather than, the way it is in the Torah, where it's just sort of aligned against one side, or it's actually a little bit different in the Torah itself. But if we were to read it in a Chumash, you just have one is 3 words long, one is 5, one is 7, but you can't sort of appreciate that aesthetically as much. Here in this layout, they're each centered, so you can sort of see expanding out to the left and to the right, from the first of the 3 to the second to the third. And here we have a little bit of a kind of precursor, I guess, to what we now refer to as kind of interlinear translation, kind of putting word by word underneath, so that you get a sense of how the words, blend together, and from Hebrew to English. So here it is. I'll read it in a more readable translation. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord shine God's face upon you and give you grace. The Lord lift up God's face to you and give you peace. At the end of our last chapter, which was also devoted to the priestly blessing, we drew attention to the fact that it gradually mounts to a climax, spreading itself out like an ever-flowing spring. This beautiful kind of literary imagery. It's interesting, sort of the language mounts to a climax, although it sort of almost goes in the other direction visually here. It sort of expands outwards, but it intensifies at the same time, as I think she just tries to express. From the above, it may be clearly seen how the number of words in Hebrew progressively increases from 3 to 5, and then to 7, expressing ever-growing plenitude. The same gradual progression to a climax can be seen in the content too, each blessing more generous than its precursor. The first blessing, and now she's about, that part is, unquestioned, that, just the fact of each one not just being longer than the other, but having kind of more dimensions than the other, is, again, sort of undeniable, although I think arguably, right, each one basically has two key verbs, right? May God bless you and keep you. May God shines God's face unto you, but still one verb, shine, and give you grace. And may God lift God's face up unto you and give you peace. So ultimately, there's 2 verbs in each one. Yivarechecha yishmerecha, ya'er vichuneka, yisa, and v'yasem. And what sort of expands is almost prepositions, direct objects, things like that. So at some level, the 3, 5, and 7 really are, equal in sort of weight of activities, but just longer in words. But I think she understands, or wants us to understand, that there's more to it than that. And, maybe even just at some level, the more expansive expressions, give a hint to that. Now she's going to try to get into how she collects different commentaries to get a sense of how these, the content of the actual blessings, one to the next, shows ongoing expansion or progression. The first blessing is for worldly goods, as Abravanel and others have explained it. Maybe we'll try, if we have a moment towards the end, to come back and see, does this resonate? Would we argue differently? But we'll take her progression based on the commentary she's choosing as a starting point. First blessing is for worldly goods, as Abravanel and others have explained it. Here, quoting Abravanel, who I already see as a favorite of hers, and we've certainly seen, I think, much more than Abravanel is studied in Jewish day school or typical Parsha classes. Both Rav Meidan and Dr. Aviva Zornberg, maybe to a lesser degree, Rav Shai, but definitely all make use of the Abravanel more than I think I typically studied it, in my earlier years. So it's interesting to see. It's a blessing for material things, that God should send them children, life and sustenance, and preserve them from want. So in Yivarechecha, in may God bless you, the Abravanel sees practical blessings, children, life, and sustenance. Interesting, this sort of triad is something that the Gemara, just thinking about this now, the Gemara links these three as three things which are dependent on mazel. The Gemara says, Bane chaye umizone bimazala talia milta. The children, life, and mizone, food or sustenance, are dependent on mazel. And there's no, we don't, notwithstanding the fact that the Torah says, if you keep the commandments, you'll get rain. But the rabbis, sort of looking around the world, see that there doesn't seem to be a direct correspondence between people's behavior and what they get in the way of children, life, and sustenance. And they offer this really different sort of reading that it's however we understand mazel, it's something beyond our direct comprehension or control. So here we're asking for blessing in those three things: keep, and preserve us from want. Keep comes after bless, meaning it's first yivarechecha and then yishmerecha. Keep, yishmerecha, comes after bless, yivarechecha, since the former refers to wealth and material bounty. After we have it, we require a blessing to safeguard and keep us from the dangers that follow from their possession, right? And you could have imagined, I could have imagined a slightly different way to finish off, right? We could have imagined keep us from the, risks to losing them, right? It could be bless us with, children and life and sustenance, and also protect us from the external forces which might, rob us of them. But the Abravanel takes a slightly different take, which is, what happens to us when we have those things? What are the dangerous, or wrongful behaviors we sometimes get engaged in once we are blessed with those blessings, and sort of protect us from mistakes we might make, pursuant to having those things. So a physical blessing to have those things, and then to kind of protect or preserve ourselves once we've been blessed with them. That's number one. 2, the second verse refers to spiritual blessing. Many commentators understand the shining of God's face to refer to the granting of enlightenment in the Torah. As Forno observes, may your eyes be illuminated by the light of God's face to see wonders in God's Torah and God's works, after you obtain your needs through God's first blessing. So first of all, we already see that the Sforno at some level understands the first blessing also to be about material or basic life needs. And now we see the sort of building almost an order of possibility. So once you have your life's needs, then you're open to, really receiving God's light, and through that seeing the wonders of God's Torah and of God's creations. I would say, as an aside or a reaction to this, I think this is a very, to me, resonant idea. There certainly are people in the world who, no matter how bad their fortune seems to be on the first three counts, children, life, and sustenance, they're able to see the wonders in God's Torah and in God's works. But I think many people I encounter find it harder to see those things when they don't have the basic blessings of the first three. And so I think it does, to me, ring true of reality that once one has stability in those other realms, it's easier, although still not necessarily easy, but it's easier to be open to, these ideas: enlightenment in the Torah, appreciation of the wonder of God's works. And she only focuses on granting of enlightenment in the Torah, but the Sforno also talks about the wonders in God's works. That I think is to appreciate the miraculous nature of creation, of the natural world. So that's number 2. Thus far, I think fairly straightforward based on the commentaries, and this is really a build up to where she wants to go now. But still, we get a chance to see her, basic interpretation: physical, material needs, and then an openness to a spiritual recognition, which, of course, I think it's also important to point out, does still depend on coming in some way as a gift from God. It's not natural or automatic to see those things. And so it's a blessing we receive and we seek to be granted the gift of being able to notice and appreciate those things. Maybe I'll pause for a moment before we get to the third blessing, just in case anybody wants to react to those first two, that idea of the, physical sustenance, basic sort of three needs of life, family, life, which we maybe call health at some level, and sustenance, financial, economic stability as sort of the first blessing, and the idea then of being protected from the dangers that come once one has those things. And then from there, an openness to appreciating, an illumination of the miraculous, wondrous nature of God's Torah and God's created world. Any thoughts, reactions, questions about that analysis so far? Okay, great. We'll go on. This is onto the heart of her analysis, which is the third blessing. The third blessing, according to many commentators, culminates in a merging of the two previous ones, a joint blessing of both worldly and spiritual bounty. Again, we'll try to come back at the end and see if this quite becomes clear or not. But this is the thesis, that somehow this is a merger of the two. Let us now turn to the first section of the third verse. And again, as last time, where there was an unclear link in her kind of flow of analysis, I'm not actually sure whether what happens in the subsequent few pages is an attempt to demonstrate this idea that the third blessing is a merging of the previous two, or if that's just a kind of a culminating comment on this analysis, and now that's finished. And now we're going to come to a different topic, which is another approach to a textual issue in the third verse. So I'm not sure whether this is an attempt to prove whether what follows is an attempt to prove this previous paragraph, or whether it's kind of a new subtopic within her analysis. Keep that question. Let us now turn to the first section of the third verse. The Lord lift up. Oh, just seeing Seth's comment. Yes, Maslow's hierarchy, but upside down. Great. Thank you. Let us now turn to the first section of the third verse. The Lord lift up God's face to you, right? In the second half is, and grant you peace. What is the meaning of this blessing, and in what way does it differ from the previous one? The Lord shine God's face upon you, right? I think a very reasonable, basic textual question. Ya'er Hashem panav elecha. Here it's not such a clearly literal translation, so maybe let's go back to hers. Ya'er Hashem panav elecha, may the Lord shine God's face upon you. Yisa Hashem panav elecha, may the Lord lift up God's face to you. So we can obviously point out that the verbs are different, but either way, it's a kind of directing of the face. One explicitly mentions light and one doesn't, but how different really are they compared to the other progressions, which are much more distinct one from another? If our commentators are right in asserting that each subsequent blessing transcends its precursor in the measure of its bounty, right? If the overall approach here is that kind of expanding, or ever-flowing or ever-expanding spring, what does Yisa improve on Ya'er? What does lift up God's face improve on shines God's face? On the contrary, does not the shining of the divine countenance symbolize greater blessing than the lifting up of God's face? Right. So here she's sort of saying, if the approach is that this is a incremental growth arrangement, it seems like we went backwards here. First, we might expect God to lift up God's face and then to shine the light of God's face. So it seems like we've gone backwards at some level. Rashi, following the Sifra and Midrash, states, the Lord lift up God's face to you, suppress God's anger. Here are the words of the Midrash. Ya'avir ka'aso mimcha, ve'ein yisa ela lashon hasara. We'll read it in English. God will remove God's anger from you. That's what lift up God's face somehow means remove God's anger. God will remove God's anger from you. How does the Midrash explain this? Yisa is an expression of removal, as in Genesis 40:19. Paro will lift up your head from off you. This is the end of my bar mitzvah parsha Vayeshev, and the Yosef's interpretation of the dream of the baker, who has the baskets on his head, and Yosef's interpretation is, in 3 days Paro will lift up your head from off of you. So in that sense, Isa doesn't just mean lift; it means separate and remove. So that's a first proof text for Yisa, mean remove. And now here's the key part. Panav, God's face, implies a face of wrath. As it is stated, I shall set my face against that soul and cut him off. Okay, a very harsh language here from Leviticus chapter 20, verse 6. The Hebrew is V'natati et panai, I will place my face b'nefesh against that person, b'nefesh ahi, b'ichrati oto, and cut it off. In other words, God will remove that face of wrath which should have been presented to you. Okay, so this is Bracha Sir Hengo, to give me one more moment. So this is the midrash on which Rashi bases Rashi's interpretation, is really just a abbreviated summary of that midrash, in which Yisa Panav, lift up God's face, instead is being taken as remove God's angry face. And so that's the interpretation here. Now she's going to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll take Bracha's question. But if that is the meaning of the blessing, then it is certainly not superior to the blessing of shine, right? If we're going from shine God's, the light of God's face, to remove God's anger, we're certainly still going backwards, right? The latter is wholly positive, the latter, which was first in order, the outpouring of divine grace and light, whereas the former is wholly negative in nature, the removal of impending evil and misfortune, right? We would expect, right, like the line in Psalm says, Sol merav aseh tov, move away from evil and do good, right? So we would expect, if this is the interpretation, to first say God will remove God's angry face, and then God will shine God's face of light. What is the basis of this unfavorable connotation of panim, face, right? So now let's take a step back and analyze this midrash. Here I feel we're in, very much in the playing field of all our previous, companion teachers, Rav Shai and Drs. Aviva Zornberg and Rav Meidan, taking a midrash and saying, okay, let's take a step back. Where is this coming from? Surely the verse quoted in Leviticus derives its unfavorable connotation not from the word face, but from the verb set and the preposition against, right? The verb there, the verse there in Leviticus was v'natati et panai ba'ish hahu. I will place my face against that person. The face is only angry because it's the thing which is being placed against that person and cutting that person off. In and of itself, face doesn't mean an angry face, right? That panim cannot be given an exclusively negative connotation emerges from a survey of its usage in the Bible. And here, one of these moments, we move back and forth with Nechama from, quotations where we see everything she sees, and then other places where in one sentence she, reveals a whole lot of research which she's not presenting to us. We could do ourselves, right? But she's saying, I looked in the concordance at all the places, or I know all the places where panim is used in the Bible, and they're far from all negative. So this reading doesn't seem like a natural or obvious reading. The Rashba, or Shlomo ben Aderet, in his commentary to the collection of Talmudic lore Ein Yaakov, notes that since the face portrays our feelings, both of anger and pleasure, the word face in the Bible can be found in all contexts expressing feeling. Thus we have in Shmuel Aleph, her face was no more sad, expressing grief, and in Psalms 31:17, expressing joy, make your face to shine on your servant, or expressing compassion, you should not lift up the face of the poor man. Thus, and we're going to see that something similar to that in a little while. Thus, there is no necessity to explain panim in our context in an unfavorable sense, especially when the predicate is elecha, to you, and not me alecha, away from you. We shall therefore cite here other views which explain panim in a different light. I don't know if there's a pun meant there on light or not. But so it just, here again, we have while this is not just a presentation of different commentaries, there's an implicit critique here saying this is not a convincing or compelling argument based on the assumptions we've made up until now, which is that the blessing is laid out and supposed to follow a progression of increasing bounty or goodness, which again doesn't mean that Rashi's interpretation is wrong. It just doesn't work with that schema. So if we accept that schema, then it's difficult to accept Rashi's interpretation. Okay, before we get to now the other readings of Panim, Bracha will come to you, and anyone else who wants to comment. Go ahead, please.
I'm just wondering, as I'm thinking about light, somehow light seems more of a generic presentation that reaches far and wide, whereas face seems a more personal presentation, especially it's like the opposite of what you would expect. You would expect that our face would be lifted up by God's presence, but it looks like God's presence is lifted up by ours. It's almost like an acknowledgement of our potential. So I get that kind of personal feeling from it.
Nice. So am I understanding, is this in this explanation, are you attempting to argue for why Yisa as the third one could be an expansion over and above Ya'er, that Ya'er, the illumination is more general, but the idea of God lifting up God's face to us is really a sense of what we could, how we could grow and achieve, not just recipients of something from God, but God granting us the power to sort of do even more ourselves.
And almost like in a Kalbachian way, Hashem showing us that Hashem gets our potential and values it.
Beautiful, beautiful. I think that's the lovely reading, and a nice reading of the kind of shift between, shining light upon us and kind of lifting up towards us. The notion of God looking up at us is quite interesting. And I think you offered a beautiful interpretation of it. Great. Anyone else want to comment? Nathan, before we go on? Yep, go ahead. You got to unmute, don't forget.
She doesn't ask this question, I don't think, but I think it's a more compelling question than the one she asks on the issue of how the Midrash uses the word panim and assumes that panim is negative, the negative countenance of God. The second pasuk has panim also, and that presumably is positive. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I don't remember what Rashi says on that one, but it's another very good point. Absolutely. Yeah, has to be considered and addressed. Thank you for pointing that out. It's great. Okay, good. We'll go further. All right. We shall therefore cite here other views which explain panim in a different light. And here a Gemara from Rosh Hashanah. Zoom out a little. It's hard to see both the Hebrew and English at once, so I'll give the English. You can read along. Gloria, the proselytess, in Hebrew, Gioret, the convert, asked Rabban Gamliel, in your Torah it is stated, who will not respect persons, asher lo yisafanim, here from Dvarim chapter 10, asher lo yisafanim v'lo yikach shochad, who will not, again, it's hard to translate here, but respect persons nor take bribes. And the yisafanim, translated here again as respect persons, is literally lift up faces. It is also written, Yisa Hashem panav elecha, the Lord will lift up God's face to you, right? So there's an attempt here to suggest that there's a contradiction in what Yisa panim means, right? In our passage, Yisa Hashem panav elecha, here the translation is bestow divine favor. God lifting God's face to you is something good. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, we're told about God, that God is asher lo yisafanim. God is a God, right? It's very explicit here in 10:17. The Lord your God is Lord supreme, great, mighty, and awesome God, who does not yisafanim, here described as show favor. Now, there's a somewhat straightforward answer to this, which she's going to delay getting to for a couple of paragraphs, we're just going to take the text at its assumption that these are two descriptions of somehow God lifting up God's face, one in which it's a blessing in our passage, and one in which it seems to be something which God is distinguished by not doing. By the way, I just noticed, and this past Shabbat in Shul, I spoke about loving the stranger, the convert, etc. It's interesting, and I haven't looked into this, whether commentaries say this about this passage in the Gemara, but it's interesting that it's specifically a proselytess, a Gioret, who asks this question, because the passage in Deuteronomy 10, which she is citing, is right juxtaposed to God is Ohev Ger, loves the convert, and says there too, you must also love the convert or the stranger. So there's some connection there that I think might be implicit in the passage. But that's as an aside. Okay, so the Gioret here is asking Rabban Gamliel, how does one resolve this contradiction? Could ask it two different ways. Does God lift God's face or not? Or we could ask it differently: is lifting a face a good thing or not a good thing? And there's much to unpack in this Gemara. The next point is also interesting. Rabban Gamliel doesn't seem to answer. Rabbi Yossi, the priest, dealt with her. So did he step in? Did Rabban Gamliel invite him to answer the question? Unclear. But Rabbi Yossi, the priest, steps in and says, let me tell you a parable. What can it be compared to? A man who had 100 zuz owing him, and fixed a time for repayment in the presence of the king, and swore by the king's life to repay him. So the debtor, makes an arrangement with the creditor. I'm going to repay you, at the king's palace, and I swear by the king's life that I'm going to make good on this debt. The time arrived, but he gave him naught. So he came to ask the king's forgiveness. The debtor comes to the king. I swore by your name, and it was a false oath. So I need your forgiveness. The king answered him, I forgive your insult of me. Go and appease your fellow. Right? So it's fine with me. I'm over the fact that you swore falsely in my name, but there's still another issue. You didn't repay the debt. You got to settle that with the creditor. The same applies here. In the former case, lo yisa panim, where God does not, show God's face or lift God's countenance, or literally God does not countenance something, that's transgressions between man and man are involved. In the latter case, transgressions between man and man's maker are indicated. So where God does lift up God's face to you, that's God will forgive, sins between you and God. But sins between man and fellow man, God will not countenance unless and until they're resolved in between the parties. It's obvious that in our context, the lifting of God's countenance towards man implies God's favor and compassion, right? That in this Gemara, what we're saying is there's a place where God does show favor and compassion and a place where God doesn't. Either way, yisafanim or yisafanav seems to indicate showing favor and compassion. And sometimes it's done and sometimes it isn't, depending on the circumstances. The juxtaposition of the two seemingly contradictory texts in the foregoing citation teach us the fundamental truth that God is more concerned about God's creatures' honor than God's own. God forgives transgressions against God's self much quicker than those committed against other men. And here I think it's just interesting, for the methodological questions about Nechama Leibowitz's writings, we're a little far, she's going to come back to it, but we're like a little far afield from the, narrower question that she asked, or even particularly a close reading of the verse anymore. And it almost feels as though some of this was a setup to introduce the more, larger ethical or theological message that the texts that cite our verse introduce, that she sort of wants to expose us to. That's a theory, which again, some of the students of her method support. Okay, we find another discussion on the same theme in the Midrash. Yisa Hashem panav, God will lift up God's face. And the Midrash asks, this is in Bamidbar Rabbah, here on our, the Midrash Rabbah on our verse, does God really lift up God's face? Right here in the question, interpretation of it seems to be show favor in the sense of favoring one over another. Doesn't it say Asher lo yisafanim? Here seeming to mean show, like preference somebody over somebody else. That's our same contradictory text. Here it's not a convertess asking a rabbi, but it's the Midrash asking itself, right? We have this contradiction. In one place it says God will lift God's face, which somehow means look specifically at someone as opposed to someone else. But in Devarim it says God doesn't do that. So God said, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, just as the same as they show me partiality, so shall I show them. This seems to be a reference to a special relationship maybe to the Jewish people or to those who show some kind of special honor and respect of God. God shows it back to them. So it's not, an internal contradiction in God. It's, again, depends on the circumstances. How so? What's the example? It says in my Torah, V'achalta v'sabata uverachta. When you eat and are satisfied, you should bless. And yet we have a situation where a person from the Jewish people sits with their family and they don't have enough to eat, right? They don't even have even to an inadequate repast, right? They don't even have enough to eat. V'nosin li panim, same verb and noun now. They lift up their face to me, umevarchin, and they bless. They say birkat hamazon. V'diktiku al atzmam ad kezayit ad kebeitza, and they have this sort of stricture, or meticulousness is a nice, better translation, even with regard to an olive size or an egg size, that even if that's all they've eaten, they consider that sufficient to be obligated in Birkat HaMazon, to express thanksgiving to God for the food, even when it's not really a fulfillment of the biblical mandate of satiety. Lefichach Yisa Hashem Panav, and so God will lift up God's face, right? For a people who are so meticulous that they, turn their face to God, even, when it doesn't feel deserved, or when it's, when they don't have, right? And this relates very much, I think, to the point of the Sforno that we saw earlier about the relationship between line number 1 and line number 2. These are people who weren't endowed with the blessings of the first, so it seems to be the blessings of the first blessing. They didn't have sufficient, food, and yet they lift their face to God in grace and thanksgiving for what they have. So in kind, God lifts God's face to them. Here also, right, the expression of lifting up the face is taken to mean going beyond the letter of the law, forgiveness and generosity. In the first quoted passage from the Gemara, however, this forgivingness is vouchsafed Israel in the case of offenses against God. Why? Because God graciously forgives the insult involving God's self, right? So just pointing out, in each case, nosei fanim, in each of them means somehow being forgiving or showing, a gracious, beyond the letter of the law kind of relationship. In the Gemara that we saw, that's God showing it to us because God, has this forbearance, nothing to do, we didn't really do anything. We made mistakes, and God goes above and beyond to show forgiveness and grace to us. But in the latter passage from the Midrash, the forgiving spirit, the going beyond the letter of the law, is vouchsafed Israel because they really deserve it, and not as an act of grace. This is, I think, just a very nice, clear reading of these two Midrashim, or, Gemara and Midrash, and how they interrelate. As it were, the Almighty observes God's people, how they bear God's yoke, serving and worshiping God even in the direst of circumstances, even down to the minutest point of law. They realize that God chose them not for worldly privilege and wealth, but for suffering and misfortune. That's a harsh framing. In spite of this, they make no complaint and do not shirk God's yoke, but do more than God commanded them. God had commanded them to bless God and say grace only when they had eaten a satisfying meal, but they praise God even on an empty stomach. They, as it were, lift up their face to God, show God favor. How can God then refrain from showing them favor? I wonder if that should be T-H-E-N. Both interpretations, that of the Midrash and Talmud, have this in common. Now where she's going to, having laid all this out, and again, like sort of made its own independent, beautiful point, showing us these Midrashim, now she's going to come back to a closer textual reading. Both interpretations, that of the Midrash and Talmud, have this in common, that they take no account of the possessive pronominal suffix in panav, God's face. The Tosafists, which she'll explain over the course of this paragraph, the Tosafists have observed this and objected, that while the text in Deuteronomy speaks of panim, referring to the face of the man who is pleading for favor, the priestly blessing speaks of panav, God's face, that of the being who is showing the favor, and not the object of the favor. Let's look at that again for a second in context, right? In the priestly blessing in our parashah, it's Yisah Hashem panav elecha. May God lift God's face or bestow God's favor upon you. Deuteronomy 10, this is a God who is lo yisah fanim, shows no favor, doesn't lift up somebody else's face preferentially, as opposed to lift God's face towards another. So they're not actually the same action and contradiction. It's not that this one says God does lift God's face, and this one says God doesn't lift God's face. This one says in the priestly blessing, God will lift God's face to you. And this one says God does not show favor. God does not lift one person's face up over another, right? So therefore, again, just clarifying, in Deuteronomy, it speaks of panim, the face of the person who's pleading for favor that God doesn't preference. The priestly blessing speaks of panav, God's face, that of the being who is showing the favor, not the object of the favor. There is therefore no contradiction between the two texts, between the partiality referred to in Deuteronomy, which does not exist before God. God doesn't lift up one face as opposed to another. And God's showing us favor, God always lifting God's face, which has the same meaning as in the blessings in Leviticus 26:9. I shall turn to you, English version, I shall have respect for you, and make you fruitful and establish my covenant with you. The Midrash explains the foregoing text thus: God will turn God's face to you. I think that's paniti alechem, right? Turn to you, but paniti is from the language of panim. So I will turn to you is turn God's face to you. So there's actually, right, so having brought us these two midrashim, which are so beautiful and striking and give us such a profound description of God, a God who, forgives people even when they don't deserve it, but then demands that they, right the wrongs with a fellow person, and then also the one who is grateful for our special commitments to God and shows us favor in kind. All of that is based on apparent contradictions, which are not actually contradictions. And that's the end of that piece. And again, I think this is sort of one standalone, citing other views which explain panim in a different light, and then sort of resolving the fact that you don't need the basis for those midrashim, even though they teach beautiful teachings. And now a final section. Hirsch, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, regards the third and final priestly blessing of God will lift up God's face to you. And now maybe we're coming back to her initial comment after this, introducing the first two, that the third is somehow a culmination of both, or a merger of both. Hirsch regards the third and final priestly blessing of God will lift up God's face to you as the climax of them all, since both spiritual and worldly possessions are means to an end. And again, in this sense, it might be actually even an entirely different one, not a merging of the two, but something which transcends the two. The third blessing of God turning God's face to us is not a means to obtain any kind of worldly or material gain. The whole of life with its bustle and tumult, its material wealth and spiritual attainments are only instruments to bring us nearer to God's service. So very echoes the language of the Haggadah, which really also, is reflected in the blessing of the Amidah. Hashivenu avinu toratecha v'karvenu malkeinu la'avodatecha. Bring us near, our sovereign, our ruler, to your service. And we have that in the Haggadah also. V'achshav keravanu hamakom la'avodato, if I'm remembering right. Now God has brought us near to worship or serve God. So I think that she's playing a little bit with that language, that material and spiritual attainments are instruments to bring us nearer to God's service. The third blessing speaks of the end itself, the supreme good, as the psalmist words it, Va'ani kirvat Elokim li tov. as is from Psalm 73, as for me, the nearness of God is my good, meaning the ultimate blessing is simply the sense of closeness. And so while she doesn't make it explicit now, if we go back, I think this is an attempt. Again, she never says this clearly, but this might be an attempt then to answer the original question, how is this a progression? So if God shining God's face upon you, and this in many ways, I think, accords entirely with Bracha's interpretation, God shining God's face upon you is not actually so relational. It's actually still from a little bit of a distance, right? It's a, it's a lamp. It's a lamp which is shining down, but is not, almost maybe it's like too bright even to look at. But light is being shown down on us, and that's the opening of our eyes, the illumination for us of spiritual possibility. But then the ultimate goal, which transcends all of that, is actually the capacity in some way to see each other, right? Imagine God, I don't know how to quite to say it, but it's as though, and this is true, I think, in I especially often reference Professor Benjamin Summers writing about this, that to the extent to which God has any perceptibility, visibility in the Tanakh, it's often as fire. And if now just try to string a couple of things together here, if God also has a front and a back in the Tanakh, right? So if God is entirely fire, the light of God could shine on us even from God's back, right? God, wherever God is, that light could shine on us without being face to face. So Ya'er Hashem Panam, it still does say God's face, but the sense seems just to be, may the light which emanates from God be upon you. And I think in this last interpretation coming from Rav Hirsch that she's citing, may the light of God shine upon you. Yes, it emerges from God's face, but it doesn't require God's face to be oriented towards you. The third one is actually the sense of God moving, reorienting in such a way that God's face is towards us. And that's the simple fact, not simple, but the plain fact of relatedness or relationship. Makes me think, I think even though this happens before Birkat Kohanim takes place, I've never really thought about this per se before. The fact that the Kohanim face away as they're saying the bracha, and then as they conclude the bracha, they turn towards the people. This is what I think happens. It's what it sounds like is happening to me, vocally. They turn towards the people, even though that's again happening before the three brachot or before the three lines of the priestly blessing are happening. I think it's almost feels like maybe it's choreographing of the process, right? So that the culmination is this sort of turning towards, right? They're there already, and through them maybe God's blessing is being channeled to us. But that idea that they actually turn towards us feels like it evokes a little bit of what's happening in the third line. That culmination of just the orienting towards and the openness to connection or proximity in some way. All right, questions, comments, reactions. Yeah, Nathan, back to you, and then Dad.
So I'm not 100% sure I have this right, but what Rabbi Hirsch said at the end about there being the presence of God being the ultimate goal. Rav Soloveitchik, and I think in more than one occasion, referred to Lefnei Hashem as being at the Beit HaMikdash. Maybe you explain on one, because I don't remember exactly. Maybe I think with Lulav and Esrog. I don't know. Right.
It says like Usmachtem Lifnei Hashem, that's a reference specifically to being somehow closer to God's presence, sort of through being at the Beit HaMikdash.
To me, the Rav Hirsch thing resonated with that, and those resonated.
Yes, in a more close proximity of relationship, so tying to the panim aspect. Yeah, great, thank you. And I appreciating Seth's comment here in the chat. I'll just read it out. With the final explanation of the third verse, it's even more parallel to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So the first of the three verses, physiological and safety, Yivarechecha and Yishmerecha, then belongingness and love needs and esteem needs, beautiful, and then self-actualization and through the channel of the relationship with God. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Dad, go ahead.
I was thinking at the very end of the third blessing, Same L'cha Shalom, granting you peace. You look at Shalom and you read it as Shalem, it's wholeness. It's, it's the combination of everything. You have physical and you have spiritual. Now you're a whole person in yourself and in your relation with God.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm trying to have this phrase in my head of like Shalem im Hashem. I don't really know if that actually exists anywhere or not, because that's sort of what seems to be the last piece if we incorporate the relationship to God and then the sort of how that ties to the sense of peace as expressed through wholeness. Beautiful. Cool. Racha, back to you again. Thank you.
Longer in one spot than another, I think.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing to me about the word shalom. It starts with shin lamed, which is shell. So it's like you have to be connected. You have to be of something to have a sense of peace. So it's not only with Hashem, but it's also with community, because this is a very communal event, the blessing.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Shell on the way to Shalem and Shalom. Lovely. Great. Wow, a lot of beautiful stuff to reflect on, and I think it does. Thinking about how this sort of plays out through the placement and the choreography of the way Birkat Kohanim is practiced, I think is really interesting. It's quite extraordinary. I would say it this way: the fact that we don't say it every day is really kind of, I don't know what adjective to put on it, but that it's just an amazing halachic, minhagic kind of reality. I don't know that we don't. I mean, in Israel they do, and I recently heard that Rav Shmuel Herzfeld, one of my extraordinary predecessors at his yeshiva, does Birkat Kohanim every day. So there are even Ashkenazic dissenters, holy dissenters to this practice, and who do say it every day, which certainly seems to have been the original intention. It's a fascinating history of how it fell out of practice in Ashkenazic communities to be said every day, and certainly heightens the specialness for those of us who only experience it on an occasional basis. But it's also so wonderful. It's nice to be able to have it every day. So Dara, is that a raised hand? We'd love to hear you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, what are we supposed to do with the phrase that Hashem chose them for suffering and misfortune?
Oh yes, I didn't. Thank you for raising it. I think I read it probably intentionally very quickly as I was preparing this. Just go back to it for a moment. They realized that God chose them not for worldly privilege and wealth, but for suffering and misfortune, right? Even if it would just have said, this is not a helpful reaction, but even if it just had said, not for worldly privilege and wealth, and not to be immune from suffering and misfortune, it would be easier. But the sense that is sort of almost our fate, our built-in fate, is very hard to swallow. And it's one of these lines where what's she basing it? Could be basing it on lived experience, and Seth writing in, is it closer to the Shoah? I don't know. I mean, these were generally in the 60s, these Gilionot mostly in the 60s. It certainly feels descriptively true, but here she seems to be making a claim that's more prescriptive. And I don't know the basis, what she meant by it. So I appreciate your raising it again. It does bear a reread and a reconsideration, but I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with her commentary in general to know, like, how, if that would, how that fits in
Yeah.
her worldview and stuff.
Me neither yet, but hopefully we will all be more by the end of Bamidbar. Not that we'll necessarily have an answer to this question, but yeah, it definitely stands out and needs some reflection further. So, all right, everybody, wonderful to learn together. Great text, and thank you to everybody for being here, for participating, and looking forward to continuing next Monday on the other side of Shavuot. Good night, all. Love to mom and dad, and good night to all.